At 3:07 in the morning, a notification changed the last 36 years of my life. I know that sounds dramatic, but stay with me here. The message came from a DNA testing app I had forgotten about months earlier. It said, "Close family match found." I rubbed my eyes, adjusted my reading glasses, and looked again. The name on the screen wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a cousin. It wasn't even someone I barely knew. It was Luke Harrison, my son Ryan's best friend. By the time my family learned the truth, a marriage, a friendship, and an entire version of our family history had already fallen apart. Before I tell you how that happened, let me ask you something. What country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We've got a lot of real-life inspired family stories to get through together. By sunrise that morning, I had already started remembering things that never made sense. Funny how that works. You can live with a mystery for 30 years and never notice it. Then one tiny piece of information slides into place, and suddenly your brain starts pulling old memories off dusty shelves, like a librarian working overtime. I made coffee at exactly 5:42 a.m., not because I looked at the clock intentionally. I just remember details like that. Occupational hazard. For 35 years I worked as a forensic document examiner. Insurance fraud, estate disputes, forged signatures, altered contracts, fake wills. If somebody changed a date from 1998 to 1993, there was a good chance I would catch it. If someone scanned a signature and pasted it into another document, I usually spotted it before lunch. My entire career was built around one simple fact: people lie. But here's the embarrassing part. I spent decades detecting lies from strangers while completely missing one inside my own family. Life has a sense of humor that way. I live in Bend, Oregon, in a modest 2-bedroom house, about 10 minutes from Pilot Butte. Nothing fancy: white siding, small garage, a stubborn maple tree in the front yard that drops leaves into my gutters every fall, as if it's conducting a personal war against me. My truck is a silver 2009 Toyota Tacoma with 214,000 miles on it. The passenger side door squeaks. The radio only works when it feels appreciated. I love that truck. Most mornings start the same way. Coffee, local news, a slow walk around the neighborhood, then maybe some work in the garage. Simple. Quiet. At 68, quiet starts feeling like a luxury. My son Ryan used to call every Sunday. Then it became every other Sunday. Then once a month. Then mostly holidays. I don't think he did it intentionally. Life happens, jobs happen, marriage happens, people get busy. But if you're a parent watching this, you know the feeling. One day you're teaching them how to ride a bicycle. The next day they're apologizing because they forgot your birthday. Not because they don't love you, because life moves faster than anyone expects. Ryan lived about 40 minutes away in Redmond with his wife Amanda. 37 years old, smart, successful, hardworking, stubborn as a mule. That part definitely came from me. Our relationship wasn't bad. It wasn't good either. Mostly it felt unfinished, like a conversation neither of us quite knew how to continue. The strange thing was that Ryan had never really pulled away from everyone. Just me. At the time I blamed the divorce. Maybe I still do. You see, his mother, Patricia Foster, everyone called her Patty, had always been better at emotional politics than I was. Patty could walk into a room and know exactly what everyone wanted to hear. She could smooth over arguments, charm strangers, convince people she was helping them while quietly helping herself. I don't mean that as an insult. It's simply true. Some people understand engines. Some people understand paperwork. Patty understood people. And after our divorce 15 years earlier, Ryan naturally spent more time with her. Again, not unusual, not suspicious, at least not back then. The thing about suspicion is that it usually arrives after the evidence, never before. I was sitting at my kitchen table that morning, staring at the DNA report on my laptop, when my mind drifted toward another name. Luke Harrison, Ryan's best friend, the boy who had practically lived in our house during high school. If Ryan was spending the night somewhere, there was a 50% chance it was Luke's house. If Luke was spending the night somewhere, there was a 50% chance it was ours. They were inseparable. Basketball, fishing, video games, summer road trips, school dances, everything. I must have cooked hundreds of hamburgers for those two boys over the years. And here's where things started bothering me. Not because of anything dramatic, because of little things, tiny things, the kinds of details most people ignore. Patty had always treated Luke differently, not dramatically differently, subtly differently. She remembered his birthday without checking calendars. She bought him Christmas gifts that cost more than Ryan's. She worried about him, constantly. I remember one afternoon back in 2006. Ryan and Luke had gotten caught driving too fast on Highway 97. Both boys were equally responsible. Ryan got grounded for 2 weeks. Luke got homemade cookies. At the time, I laughed about it. Actually, I teased Patty about it. I remember standing in our kitchen wearing a faded Oregon Ducks sweatshirt, starting to think you like Luke better than our own son. Patty froze, just for a second. Then she laughed. The conversation moved on. But now that moment felt different. Stay with me here. When you're looking backward after discovering a secret, every memory becomes dangerous. Because you don't know which memories matter, and which ones you're rewriting inside your own head. I tried to stay objective. That's another habit from my old job. Facts first, emotions second. So I opened the DNA report again. I read every line. Then again, then a third time. The relationship estimate wasn't vague. It wasn't distant. It wasn't something that could be explained away by a shared ancestor from the Civil War. The match was close. Very close. Close enough that my stomach tightened every time I looked at the screen. Outside, the sun was rising over the Cascades. Inside, my coffee had gone cold. I sat there for nearly an hour, thinking, remembering, trying not to jump to conclusions. Then another memory surfaced. A strange one. Years ago, whenever Luke's family had financial trouble, Patty somehow knew before anyone else. Luke needed braces. Patty knew. Luke's mother lost a job. Patty knew. Luke needed help paying for community college classes. Patty knew. I had always assumed small-town gossip explained it. Now I wasn't so sure. And there was something else. Something I hadn't thought about in years. Every Christmas, Luke's mother mailed a handwritten card. Most years it was addressed to the entire family. But one year was different. One year Patty took that card and put it away before anyone else could read it. At the time, I thought nothing of it. People do odd things. Married couples collect harmless little mysteries. But suddenly that forgotten Christmas card felt important. Very important. You know that feeling when a song gets stuck in your head, you can't focus on anything else until you hear it. That's what that memory felt like. The card, the handwriting, Patty's reaction. Something about it refused to leave me alone. And after 35 years of investigating fraud, I'd learned to trust that feeling. Not because it was magic, because your brain often notices patterns before your conscious mind catches up. I looked toward the garage. That's where all the old storage boxes were. Tax records, family photos, holiday decorations, letters, documents, pieces of a life accumulated over decades. And somewhere inside those boxes, if my memory was correct, was a Christmas card nobody had thought about in over 30 years. I stood up, finished the last sip of cold coffee, grabbed my flashlight, and headed toward the garage. Because the DNA report had given me a question. But I had a feeling the paperwork might finally give me an answer. The garage smelled like sawdust, motor oil, and old memories. If you've ever owned a house for more than 20 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Every cardboard box becomes a time capsule. Every shelf becomes a museum exhibit nobody intended to create. I switched on the overhead light and stared at nearly 3 decades of accumulated life. Christmas decorations, camping gear, old fishing rods, 3 different boxes labeled important documents. I laughed when I saw that. In my experience, whenever someone labels a box important documents, there's about a 40% chance it's actually full of extension cords and instruction manuals for appliances they no longer own. Fortunately, this time I got lucky. The second box contained family records, photo albums, tax returns, school certificates, greeting cards, hundreds of greeting cards. I carried the entire box into the kitchen and started sorting. Birthday cards, anniversary cards, graduation cards, Christmas cards. The morning disappeared faster than I expected. Around 11:15 a.m., I finally found it. December 1990. The envelope was slightly yellowed with age. The front was addressed to the Foster family. I immediately recognized the handwriting. Susan Harrison, Luke's mother. I sat down slowly. My pulse had started doing something I didn't particularly appreciate. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to remind me that I wasn't looking through history anymore. I was looking for answers. I opened the card. Inside was a short Christmas message. Warm, friendly, completely ordinary. At first. Then I noticed something. Actually, I noticed several things. You need to understand something. For 35 years, my job trained me to notice tiny inconsistencies. Most people read words. I read patterns, spacing, pressure marks, ink flow, corrections, timing. The message itself wasn't suspicious. The signature was, specifically the way Susan signed her name. There was evidence of hesitation, tiny pauses, unnatural pen lifts, the kind of thing you see when somebody copies handwriting instead of producing it naturally. I looked again, and again. Could I prove anything from a Christmas card? Absolutely not. But my instincts were awake now, and once they wake up, they rarely go back to sleep. I carried the card into my home office and placed it under a desk lamp. Then I retrieved a magnifying lens from an old drawer. Retirement doesn't completely cure professional habits. After 10 minutes of examination, I reached a conclusion. The signature looked authentic. The message above it didn't. Different pressure, different rhythm, different writing speed. Someone had likely written the body of the card. Susan had signed it afterward. Interesting. Very interesting. But not enough. Not even close. I needed more. So I started searching through photographs. Hundreds of them. Some were from birthdays, some from camping trips, some from school events. Ryan and Luke appeared together in nearly every album after age 10. Best friends. Brothers, almost. I found a photograph from July 2002. The boys were sitting on the dock at Sparks Lake. Ryan was 14. Luke was 13, both holding fishing poles, both sunburned, both grinning. I remember taking that picture. At the time, I thought they looked nothing alike. Now I wasn't so sure. The resemblance wasn't obvious, not the kind people immediately notice, but there were similarities. The jawline, the eyebrows, the shape of the nose. Enough to make me uncomfortable, not enough to make me certain. I hate certainty without evidence. That's another occupational defect. Around noon, my phone rang. Linda, my younger sister. Well, technically younger. Only by 3 years. She still treats me like an older brother when she needs advice and like a younger brother when she wants to criticize my life choices, which is often. Edgar. Linda, you sound terrible. Good afternoon to you, too. Have you eaten? I looked at the clock. I had not. I've had coffee. That's not food. It's bean soup. No? Close enough. Open your front door. I blinked. What? Open the door. I walked outside. There she was, standing beside her blue Subaru Outback, holding a pink bakery box, smiling. You looked miserable yesterday, she said. So I brought reinforcements. Inside the box were maple bars from Richard's Donuts. My favorite. Some people save lives with medicine. Linda uses pastries. We sat at my kitchen table. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Just enough. The DNA match, Luke's name, my concerns. Linda listened quietly. Then she took a long sip of coffee. Wow, that's your expert analysis. Would you prefer panic? No? Good. Then, wow. I couldn't help laughing. That's one thing about Linda. She knows exactly when a situation needs seriousness, and exactly when it needs a little air. For a few minutes we talked about completely unrelated things. Her dog, her garden, the fact that neither of us understood modern streaming services. It felt good. Necessary, actually. Because once we returned to the DNA conversation, everything felt heavier. You think Ryan isn't your biological son? It wasn't a question. I stared at the table. I think that's one possibility. And Luke? I nodded slowly. Linda was silent for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. Have you considered another possibility? What? The DNA service made a mistake. I smiled. That would certainly simplify things. You'd like that? More than you know. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Not dramatically, just enough. That's what good family does. They don't always solve problems. Sometimes they simply remind you that you're not carrying them alone. After she left, I returned to the evidence, and that's when I found something I hadn't expected. Tucked between 2 photo albums was a folded piece of paper. A receipt, old, faded, dated August 17th, 1988, the year before Ryan was born. The receipt itself wasn't important. The location was a motel in Eugene, Oregon. 1 room, 1 night, paid in cash. The name on the receipt wasn't Patty. It wasn't Susan. It was barely readable. But I recognized the handwriting. Patty's. The note scribbled on the back read, "Keep this hidden." I stared at those 3 words. Maybe they meant nothing. Maybe they meant everything. The problem with secrets is that they create gravity. Once you discover one secret, every unexplained detail starts orbiting around it. The receipt, the Christmas card, the DNA match, the financial help, Patty's strange protectiveness toward Luke. Each clue by itself was weak. Together they were becoming difficult to ignore. By late afternoon, my dining room table looked like the planning board from a detective movie. Photos, notes, documents, timelines. I stood back and looked at everything. One question kept repeating inside my head. Not, what happened? Not anymore. The question had changed. Now it was, what does Luke know? Because if my growing suspicion was correct, there was another victim in this story. Maybe 2. Ryan certainly didn't know. That much felt obvious. But Luke I couldn't tell, and I needed to find out. Not through accusations, not through confrontation. Just a conversation, a simple conversation, the kind 2 people could have over coffee and eggs. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, found Luke's number. and after staring at it for nearly a minute, I finally pressed call. Luke answered on the third ring. Edgar. I hadn't heard his voice in several months. Not because we disliked each other. Life just drifts people apart, especially after children become adults. Parents slowly move from being central characters to supporting cast members. It's natural. Doesn't make it pleasant, but it's natural. Hey, Luke, everything okay? There was immediate concern in his voice. That struck me. Most people answer phone calls expecting favors. Luke sounded like he was worried about me. Everything's fine, I said. A lie. Not a terrible lie. Just a practical one. I was wondering if you'd like breakfast sometime this week. A brief pause. Breakfast? Last time I checked, that's still legal. He laughed. Same laugh he'd had since he was 15. I'm free Thursday morning. McKay Cottage. Sounds good. 9 o'clock. I'll be there. When the call ended, I sat quietly for several moments. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe nervousness. Maybe hesitation. Maybe some indication that Luke knew something. Instead, he sounded exactly like the same kid I'd watched grow up. That bothered me more than suspicion would have. Because guilty people often reveal themselves. Innocent people rarely do. Thursday arrived cold and clear. Classic Oregon spring weather. 43 degrees at breakfast and probably 70 by afternoon. I parked my Tacoma outside McKay Cottage restaurant at 8:47 a.m. Old habits. I arrive early to everything. Partly because I hate being late. Partly because being early gives you time to observe. Luke arrived 6 minutes later in a gray Ford F-150. When he stepped out, I found myself studying him. Not intentionally. At least, that's what I told myself. But the truth is, I was looking for resemblance, looking for answers, looking for something, anything. He waved, smiled, walked toward the entrance. And for a brief moment, I hated myself. Because he wasn't evidence. He wasn't a case file. He was a human being. A good one. Inside, we took a booth near the window. The same booth Ryan and Luke used to fight over whenever we came here after fishing trips. Funny how memory sneaks into ordinary places. The waitress recognized both of us. Small towns are like that. She called me Mr. Foster and called Luke Honey. Nobody escapes local restaurant culture. We ordered coffee, pancakes for him, omelet for me. The conversation started naturally. Work, weather, sports, the usual things men discuss when they're avoiding the things they actually want to discuss. Eventually, I asked about his mother, Susan Harrison. The question seemed harmless. Luke didn't react. My mom's doing okay. Still in Eugene. Yeah. Retired. Mostly. I nodded, trying to sound casual, trying not to sound like a retired investigator conducting an interview. Not easy. Trust me. She always seemed nice. Luke smiled. She is. Then something changed. Subtle, but noticeable. His smile weakened slightly. You know she had a rough time when I was younger. I leaned forward. How so? He stirred his coffee, looking down. My dad left when I was little. That much I already knew. Everyone knew, or thought they knew. He paid child support occasionally. Luke shrugged. Mostly when a court forced him to. I said nothing, just listened. People reveal more when silence gives them room. My mom worked 2 jobs for years. His eyes remained on the coffee cup. We almost lost our apartment twice. I remembered none of this. Ryan had never mentioned it. Patty certainly hadn't. Then Luke said something that made every alarm bell inside my head ring at once. We would have been in serious trouble without Patty. I kept my expression neutral, barely. What do you mean? She helped us. How? Money. Simple answer. Simple word. Huge implication. I took a sip of coffee, buying myself a few seconds. How much money? Luke shrugged. I don't know exactly. Enough to matter. I stayed silent. He continued. Sometimes groceries would show up. Sometimes rent assistance. School expenses. Things like that. I felt my stomach tighten. Because this wasn't occasional kindness. This was a pattern, a long-term pattern. And I had never known about it. Did Ryan know? Luke laughed. No. The answer came immediately. No chance. That interested me. Why not? Because Patty always said not to tell anyone. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter. Not actually quieter, just different. Like my brain had turned the volume down on everything except that sentence. Patty always said not to tell anyone. Not me, not Ryan, not anyone. I looked out the window. Traffic moving along Newport Avenue. A couple walking their dog. A delivery truck. Normal life continuing as if nothing had changed. Inside my head, however, things were changing quickly. Did she ever explain why? Luke shook his head. She always called it helping a friend. A friend. Yeah. My mom and Patty knew each other from years ago. Luke smiled slightly. Honestly, I thought she was just being generous. Generous. Maybe. Or maybe guilty. Or protective. Or both. The thing about motives is that people rarely operate from only one. The waitress delivered our food. For several minutes, neither of us discussed anything important. Pancakes have a way of interrupting emotional revelations. Another reason I like breakfast meetings. Eventually, I asked a different question. A careful question. Have you ever taken a DNA test? Luke looked surprised, then laughed. Actually, yeah. My heart skipped, just once. Really? Last year. Why? My wife bought those ancestry kits for everyone at Christmas. I kept chewing. Slowly. Very slowly. Pay attention to this next part. Because this was the moment I realized Luke truly knew nothing. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. No tension, no hesitation, no guarded behavior, nothing. Just honesty. I found a bunch of relatives I never knew existed. He smiled. Mostly second cousins. Then he added, my mom hated the whole thing. I froze. Inside. Not outside. Outside I remained calm. Years of courtroom testimony teaches you that skill. She did. Absolutely. Luke laughed again. She acted like I'd joined a cult. That was interesting. Very interesting. Did she say why? Privacy. He shrugged. At least that's what she claimed. Privacy. Maybe. Or fear. As breakfast continued, I became increasingly convinced of one thing. Luke was not part of whatever secret existed. He wasn't manipulating anyone. He wasn't hiding information. If anything, he seemed just as unaware as Ryan. Maybe more. And somehow that made me feel worse. Because now there weren't just potential lies. There were potential victims. By the time we finished eating, I knew I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. I didn't have enough evidence. I had suspicions, patterns, questions, but not proof. And accusations without proof destroy people. I've seen it happen. So instead I paid the bill. We walked outside. The morning sun was warming the parking lot. Luke thanked me for breakfast. Then he said something that stayed with me all day. You know, Edgar, Ryan always talks about how much he respected you growing up. I blinked. What? Luke smiled. He doesn't say it very well. No kidding. But he does. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. I stood there watching until he disappeared around the corner. Because now I had two mysteries. The first was the DNA match. The second was why Patty had spent decades quietly supporting Luke's family while keeping it hidden from everyone else. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect the answer to both mysteries was exactly the same. I spent the next 3 days doing something that would probably sound strange to anyone who has never worked investigations. I stopped looking for answers, at least directly. Sometimes people become so focused on finding one specific fact that they miss everything surrounding it. I learned years ago that the truth rarely arrives wearing a name tag. It usually arrives disguised as something ordinary. A receipt, a bank statement, an email, a forgotten conversation. So instead of chasing theories, I started building timelines. My dining room table disappeared beneath paperwork. Again, tax records, property records, old calendars, family photographs, notes, dates, names, patterns, lots of patterns. And one pattern kept appearing. Patty. No matter where I started, the trail eventually circled back to Patty. By Sunday afternoon, I had reconstructed nearly 20 years of overlapping events involving our family and the Harrisons. The results weren't proof, but they were uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. For example, every major financial crisis Susan Harrison experienced seemed to coincide with unexplained withdrawals from accounts Patty controlled. Not large withdrawals. That's what made them interesting. Large transactions attract attention. Small ones disappear. $300, $500, $800, $1,000 here, $1,200 there. Always enough to help, never enough to raise alarms. I probably would have missed it years ago. Now I couldn't stop seeing it. Then Monday morning arrived, and with it came the first real sign that Patty was hiding something. My phone rang at 8:11 a.m. The caller ID showed her name. That alone was unusual. Patty and I communicated mostly through text messages, brief ones, polite ones, the kind exchanged by divorced people who have spent years perfecting emotional distance. I answered. "Hello? Edgar?" Her voice sounded pleasant. Too pleasant. That may sound unfair, but after 40 years of knowing someone, you learn their different versions. This was Patty's "I want something" voice. "What can I do for you?" I was wondering if we could meet. I sat back in my chair. Interesting. About what? A family matter. That answer was even more interesting. What family matter? A brief pause. I'd rather discuss it in person. Now the alarm bells were ringing, loudly. Stay with me here. When someone avoids specifics, they're usually protecting information. The question is whether they're protecting it from you or from themselves. When? I asked. Tomorrow afternoon. Where? My house. I looked out the kitchen window. Rain had started falling. Slow Oregon rain. The kind that seems permanent without actually accomplishing much. Fine. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. When the call ended, I stared at my phone. Patty never called without a reason. And my instincts were telling me this wasn't a coincidence. Not anymore. The next day I drove to her house, a beige 2-story place in Southwest Bend. She'd bought it after our divorce. I had helped move furniture into it. Funny how life works. Sometimes you help build the stage where future betrayals eventually perform. Her black Lexus SUV sat in the driveway. Ryan's blue Honda Pilot sat beside it. That immediately changed the situation. Ryan was involved. I parked and walked toward the front door. Patty greeted me with a smile. Ryan greeted me with tension. You know that look. The look someone wears when they've already decided you're wrong before the conversation begins. We sat around the dining room table. The atmosphere felt strange, prepared, almost rehearsed. Then Patty placed a folder on the table. And suddenly everything made sense. Not the DNA mystery, something else. The property, Sparks Lake, the family cabin, The cabin had belonged to my father. After his death, ownership became shared through a trust arrangement. Nothing complicated, at least not originally. Patty pushed the folder toward me. "We need to clean up some paperwork." There it was. Paperwork, the universal language of trouble. I opened the folder. Property transfer documents, trust modifications, ownership changes, signatures, lots of signatures. Ryan leaned forward. "It'll simplify things for everyone." I looked at him. "What things?" "The future." Vague answer. Never a good sign. I continued reading. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because the proposal was unreasonable, because the documents were strangely familiar. A particular signature page caught my attention. I froze, not visibly, internally. There was my signature, supposedly, dated nearly 4 years earlier. The problem: I had never signed that document. Now, before anyone panics, let me clarify. This wasn't some cartoon-level forgery. Nobody had traced my name with a crayon. It was much smarter than that. Someone had taken a legitimate signature from an older document, scanned it, digitally inserted it, then reproduced it elsewhere. Most people would never notice. Most lawyers might not notice. Most judges might not notice. Unfortunately for whoever created it, I had spent 3.5 decades noticing exactly that kind of thing. I kept reading, calmly, slowly. Patty mistook my silence for acceptance. Big mistake. Greedy people often confuse patience with weakness. Ryan finally spoke. "So," I looked up. "So what? Are you willing to sign?" I closed the folder. Gently, very gently. "Not today." Patty's smile disappeared. "Only slightly. But enough." "Why not?" "Because I want to review everything first." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, at least emotionally. Ryan sighed dramatically, the same way he had sighed as a teenager whenever someone asked him to clean his room. "Come on, Dad." Dad. Interesting choice. He hadn't called me that once during our last 3 conversations. Now suddenly I was Dad again. Convenient. It's standard paperwork. No such thing. What? No such thing as standard paperwork. I smiled slightly. Only paperwork people haven't examined yet. Ryan looked annoyed. Patty looked nervous. And that surprised me, because nervousness suggested awareness. Awareness suggested intent. Intent suggested a much bigger problem. I stood up, collected the folder, and prepared to leave. Patty stopped me. "Edgar." I turned. Her expression softened, or attempted to. "We're family." There are moments when a sentence accidentally becomes funny. This was one of them. Not because the statement was false, because of the timing. Family. That word suddenly carried more uncertainty than it ever had. I nodded politely. "Exactly." Then I left. The moment I reached my truck, I pulled out my phone. Not to call police, not to call Ryan, not even to call Patty. I called the one person I trusted with complicated legal problems. Frank Delaney, former litigation attorney, former fishing partner, current owner of the most sarcastic personality in Oregon. He answered immediately. "Edgar." "Frank, you're calling before noon. That's bad. It usually means somebody forged something." I laughed, a short laugh, the kind people make when they realize a joke isn't actually a joke. Frank became silent. Then he asked, "What happened?" I looked back at Patty's house, at Ryan's vehicle, at the life I'd spent years believing I understood. Then I said the words that changed everything. "I think someone just handed me proof they never expected me to recognize, and for the first time since that DNA notification arrived at 3:07 in the morning, I stopped feeling confused, because confusion was turning into evidence, and evidence was something I knew exactly how to handle. Frank Delaney arrived in Bend 2 days later. That alone should tell you how seriously he took the situation. Frank hated driving. Always had. The man would rather argue with a federal judge than spend 3 hours on Interstate 97. So when he pulled into my driveway in his dark green Chevrolet Tahoe just after noon on Thursday, I knew he had already decided this was worth his time. Frank was 70 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, white hair, permanent expression of mild disappointment. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 40 years listening to people explain why their bad decisions weren't technically bad decisions. He carried a leather briefcase into my kitchen and immediately pointed at the paperwork spread across my dining room table. "Please tell me this isn't all organized by date." "It is," he sighed. "You were always the most annoying investigator I worked with." "Good to see you, too." We shook hands, then got to work. For the next 4 hours, we examined every page Patty had given me. Every signature, every attachment, every amendment, every transfer authorization. By the end of the afternoon, Frank removed his reading glasses and leaned back in his chair. "Well?" I waited. "That's not a word lawyers use when things are good." "No." "So?" Frank tapped one particular document. "The signature isn't authentic." I nodded. "I know." "Actually," he said, "it's worse than that." That got my attention. Frank continued. Whoever assembled these documents wasn't patient. There was that word again. Patient. Or rather the lack of it. The weakness we'd already identified in Patty. Impatience, greed, overconfidence. Frank pointed towards several pages. "The digital insertion isn't consistent." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "The copied signature came from different source documents." Now I understood. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The size varied slightly. The resolution changed. The pixel density wasn't identical. Different signatures, different originals, combined into one package. A shortcut, a careless shortcut, the kind people take when they become convinced nobody will ever look closely. Frank smiled. "Most people would have signed this." "I know." "Most attorneys would have missed this, too." "I know." He pointed at me. "Unfortunately for them, you're a paranoid old man. That's one way to describe 35 years of professional training." "It's my preferred way." I laughed. And for the first time in weeks, the laugh felt genuine. Not because the situation was funny, because certainty was beginning to replace confusion. Confusion drains energy. Evidence restores it. By evening, we had assembled a separate file. A real file. Not theories, not suspicions. Evidence. The questionable signatures. Timeline inconsistencies. Financial records. Property history. Patterns connecting Patty to Susan Harrison over multiple decades. Still not enough to explain the DNA match, but enough to prove something important. Patty was hiding information. A lot of information. And she was willing to manipulate legal documents to protect whatever that information was. Frank stayed overnight in Bend. The next morning we met for breakfast. Not at McKay Cottage this time. A small diner on 3rd Street where the coffee tasted like punishment and the bacon tasted like redemption. Frank was halfway through his second cup when he asked a question I'd been avoiding. "What about Ryan?" I stared at my plate. "What about him?" "He involved." The question hung between us. I honestly didn't know. That was the problem. Some evidence pointed toward manipulation. Other evidence pointed toward ignorance. I thought about Ryan sitting at Patty's dining room table, the frustration, the impatience, the confidence. Then I remembered something else, something subtle. He never once looked surprised when I refused to sign. Annoyed, absolutely. Surprised, no. I think he knows about the property documents. Frank nodded. And the DNA situation. I looked away. No idea. Frank didn't press further. Good attorneys know when silence is more productive than questions. Later that afternoon, another surprise arrived. Ryan called. That hadn't happened in almost 6 weeks. I answered. Hey. His tone was stiff. Dad. We still using that word? Silence. Then a sigh. I just want to understand why you're making this difficult. There it was. The narrative. Not fraud. Not forged signatures. Not suspicious documents. Difficulty. I leaned back in my chair. Ryan, did you read those papers? Of course. Every page. Most of them. Interesting. Most of them. Not all. Most. That told me something. Maybe not everything, but something. You trust them? Mom wouldn't lie about this. I closed my eyes. There are moments in life when you can practically hear future heartbreak approaching. This was one of them. Not because Ryan was wrong, because he sounded exactly like I used to sound. 30 years earlier, when I trusted Patty completely, when I believed questions were unnecessary because trust already existed. I need you to understand something. Trust isn't stupidity. People often confuse the two. Trust is simply what happens when someone spends years earning your confidence. The tragedy comes when they spend years preparing to abuse it. Ryan? What? I want you to do something. What? Read every page. Dad, every page. I interrupted him. Not most. Every. He sounded irritated. You think you're the only smart person in the family. That stung more than I expected, because there was truth buried inside the accusation, not arrogance, distance. Ryan had spent years seeing me as the man who analyzed everything. The investigator, the critic, the examiner. Maybe somewhere along the way he forgot I was also just his father. Maybe I forgot too. The call ended badly. Not hostile. Just unresolved. The worst kind. Afterward, I sat alone on my back deck watching rain drift across the yard. Thinking, questioning, remembering. Then my phone vibrated again. A text message. Not from Ryan. From Linda. My sister had somehow developed a supernatural ability to contact me precisely when I was having a terrible day. The message contained only 6 words. Chilly tonight. No excuses. 6 p.m. I smiled despite myself. At 6 o'clock I arrived at her house. The smell hit me before the front door opened. Homemade chili, cornbread, comfort food. Linda greeted me with the same energy she brought to everything, which is to say, slightly aggressive kindness. You look awful. Thank you. Sit down. During dinner, we discussed absolutely none of the important things. Dogs, weather, politics, movies, the fact that both of us were suddenly old enough to injure ourselves while sleeping. At one point, Linda spent 5 minutes describing a shoulder injury caused by reaching for a television remote. I laughed so hard coffee came out my nose, which at 68 carries genuine medical risk. For 2 hours, I felt normal. Not an investigator, not a potential victim, not a father questioning 37 years of history, just a brother eating chili. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's exactly what keeps you going. When I finally drove home that evening, my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. And that's when I noticed something. A white envelope sticking out of my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Hand-delivered. I opened it inside the kitchen. There was only a single sheet of paper. 1 sentence. Typed. Anonymous. No signature. No explanation, no greeting, just 1 sentence. Ask Susan Harrison what happened in Eugene during August of 1988. I read it once, then twice, then a 3rd time. The date matched the motel receipt, the same receipt I'd found hidden among the old family documents. My pulse quickened. Because somebody else knew. Somebody else had been watching. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I realized the secret might be much larger than I originally thought. I barely slept that night. Not because of fear, because of momentum. There's a difference. Fear keeps you awake imagining possibilities. Momentum keeps you awake because your mind is already moving faster than your body can follow. The anonymous note sat on my kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. Simple, direct, dangerous. Ask Susan Harrison what happened in Eugene during August of 1988. No signature, no explanation, no clue who delivered it. I checked the security camera mounted above my garage. The camera wasn't particularly sophisticated. It mostly existed to tell me whether deer were eating my tomatoes. Still, it was worth checking. At 9:14 p.m., a vehicle stopped briefly near the mailbox. Not enough lighting for a license plate, not enough detail for identification. Just a shadow, a silhouette, a mystery. Perfect. Because apparently my life had become a detective novel written by someone with boundary issues. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I was already on the road to Eugene. 2 hours and 40 minutes south. Interstate 97, then Highway 58, then Interstate 5. Long stretches of Oregon forest sliding past the windshield. The kind of drive that gives a person too much time to think. I thought about Ryan. I thought about Luke. Mostly I thought about Susan Harrison. For 36 years she had existed on the edge of my life. Birthday parties, football games, graduation ceremonies, neighborhood cookouts, always present, never central. Now suddenly she might hold answers that could rearrange my entire family history. Funny how quickly people move from background character to main suspect. I arrived in Eugene shortly after 10. Susan lived in a modest single-story house near the River Road area. White siding, blue shutters, small front porch, wind chimes. The kind of house built by someone who valued peace. I sat in my truck for nearly 5 minutes, preparing, not for confrontation, for disappointment, because that's something investigations teach you. Most answers aren't dramatic. Most answers are messy, complicated, human. Eventually, I walked to the front door and knocked. Susan answered almost immediately. The moment she saw me, her smile appeared, then disappeared. That alone told me plenty. "Edgar?" Her voice sounded surprised and nervous, very nervous. I was in the area. A terrible lie. Possibly the worst lie I've ever told. She knew it. I knew it. Neither of us acknowledged it. "Can we talk?" For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Family photographs lined the walls. Luke appeared in many of them. A few included Ryan. Looking at those pictures suddenly felt strange, like staring at evidence hidden in plain sight. Susan motioned toward a chair. I sat. She remained standing. Another signal. People sit when they feel comfortable. They stand when they're preparing to defend themselves. Finally, she spoke. "What happened?" Interesting question. Not why are you here? Not how have you been? What happened? As if she already knew something had happened. I reached into my jacket pocket, removed a folded copy of the DNA report, placed it on the coffee table. Then waited. Susan stared at it, didn't touch it, didn't read it, just stared. And in that moment, I knew. Not the details, not the whole truth. But enough, because innocent confusion looks different. What I saw wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The kind people experience when a secret they've feared for decades finally arrives at their front door. Her shoulders sagged, slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then she sat down, very slowly. Oh, God. 3 words, that's all. 3 words told me more than 100 denials could have. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question. What happened in Eugene in August of 1,988 inches? Susan closed her eyes. The reaction was immediate, painful, genuine. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, not theatrical tears, old tears, the kind carried for decades. Who told you that date? Anonymous note. She laughed once, a sad laugh. Of course. What happened? Susan looked toward the window, toward the backyard, toward somewhere far away in time. When Patty got pregnant. My heart stopped. Not literally, but close enough. When Patty got pregnant, she repeated, everything changed. I stayed silent, listening. Years of interviews had taught me the value of silence. Susan continued. We were friends. Close friends. I knew things about her nobody else knew. The room felt smaller. Every sentence increased the pressure. Then came the first real revelation. Patty was terrified. Why? Because she wasn't sure who the father was. The words landed like a hammer. Not because I hadn't considered the possibility, because hearing someone else say it made it real. I swallowed hard. Susan continued. She told me there were 2 possibilities. My pulse accelerated. Me and someone else. Susan nodded. Yes. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The clock on the wall suddenly sounded very loud. Tick, tick, tick. Then I asked the obvious question. Who? Susan hesitated, and that hesitation told me the answer mattered. A lot. Finally, she whispered, David Harrison, Luke's father, or the man Luke believed was his father. I stared at her, trying to process what I had just heard. Patty, David, pregnancy, 2 possible fathers, August 1988, the motel receipt, the DNA match. The puzzle pieces were beginning to connect, but not completely. Something still didn't fit. You knew? Susan nodded slowly. I knew there was uncertainty. And then Patty decided she didn't want to know. That surprised me. What? She refused testing. Susan wiped her eyes. Back then, DNA testing wasn't simple. She said she'd choose the version of the story that caused the least damage. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the irony was overwhelming. The least damage. 36 years later, the damage was still spreading. Then Susan revealed the second bombshell, the one I hadn't expected. After Ryan was born, Patty became convinced you were the father. Why? Because Ryan looked like you. Reasonable, at least superficially. So that was it. Susan shook her head. No. Her eyes met mine, and I suddenly knew something terrible was coming. 3 years later, I became pregnant with Luke. I froze. Completely. Susan continued. David and I were having serious problems. My mouth felt dry, very dry. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Patty paid for the hospital expenses. I stared at her, not understanding. Not yet. Susan looked away, ashamed, broken, exhausted, because she was afraid. Afraid of what? Susan began crying quietly, not loudly, just enough, just honestly. Then she whispered, afraid Luke might answer the question she spent years trying not to ask. The room became silent, dead silent, and for the first time since the DNA notification appeared on my phone at 3:07 in the morning, I finally understood why Patty had spent decades secretly helping Susan and Luke. It wasn't generosity. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't guilt alone. It was fear. 36 years of fear. Fear that one DNA test could destroy an entire life built on uncertainty. And now that DNA test had finally arrived. I drove back to Bend in complete silence. No radio, no podcasts, no music, just the sound of tires against wet pavement, and one uncomfortable realization repeating itself inside my head. For 36 years, Patty had built her life around uncertainty. Not certainty, not truth, uncertainty. And somehow that made everything worse. If she'd known the answer and hidden it, that would have been one kind of betrayal. But what Susan described was different. Patty had deliberately avoided the answer, then spent 3 decades controlling everyone around her to prevent the answer from ever appearing. That wasn't a mistake. That was a lifestyle. The problem was that Susan's confession, as important as it was, still wasn't enough. I had stories, I had context, I had motives, but I didn't yet have proof strong enough to put everything on the table. And if I was going to expose 36 years of deception, I wasn't going to do it halfway. Not with Ryan, not with Luke, not with lives this important. By the time I reached Bend, I had already made a decision. I wasn't confronting Patty. Not yet. I was going to wait, because greedy people have a habit of finishing the job for you. All you have to do is give them time. 3 days later, Patty called again. This time, she didn't bother pretending the conversation was casual. We need to finish the paperwork. Straight to business. Interesting. The pressure was increasing, which meant she was worried. Good. Worried people make mistakes. When? I asked. Saturday. What happened Saturday? Family meeting. There it was. The phrase itself sounded harmless. But I immediately understood what she was doing. She wanted witnesses. Witnesses create pressure. Pressure creates compliance. Classic manipulation. Who's coming? A brief pause. Then, Ryan. Not surprising. Amanda. Reasonable. Then another name. Luke. I nearly smiled. Almost. Not because it was funny, because it was perfect. Patty was inviting Luke, the one person she had spent decades secretly protecting, the one person connected to the DNA report, the one person who could unintentionally destroy her entire story, just by existing. Arrogance really is expensive. I'll be there. The moment the call ended, I phoned Frank. Then Linda. By sunset, all 3 of us were sitting around my dining room table. Frank reviewed documents. Linda supplied snacks. Every successful legal strategy requires 1 attorney and 1 woman carrying cookies. That's just science. The plan itself was simple. Actually simpler than anything I'd imagined during those sleepless nights. No traps, no dramatic reveals, no ambush, just evidence. Cold, precise, undeniable evidence. The forged signatures, the financial transfers, the timeline, the DNA report, Susan's signed statement, property records, everything organized in chronological order. 36 years compressed into a single folder. At one point, Linda looked at the stack and shook her head. You know what's sad? What? Patty probably thinks the property paperwork is still the biggest problem. I looked at her. She wasn't wrong. From Patty's perspective, the cabin mattered. The assets mattered. The ownership mattered. Because greed narrows your vision. When people become obsessed with protecting money, they often stop protecting relationships. The irony was devastating. By trying to secure property, Patty had exposed something infinitely more valuable. The truth. Saturday arrived cold and cloudy. Oregon weather seemed determined to provide dramatic atmosphere whether anyone asked for it or not. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Ryan's house in Redmond. I arrived exactly at 1:52. Frank arrived at 1:55. Linda arrived at 1:58 carrying a tray of brownies. Because of course she did. Inside the house, everyone was already gathered. Ryan, Amanda, Patty, and Luke. The moment I saw Luke, a strange sadness hit me. He looked relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware of the earthquake sitting beneath the floorboards. That innocence wouldn't survive the afternoon. I hated that, more than I expected. Patty welcomed everyone with artificial warmth, the kind people use when they're trying to control a room. Coffee, small talk, weather, sports, traffic, all the meaningless rituals people perform before conflict begins. Eventually, Patty brought out the folder, the same forged documents, the same plan. Ryan leaned forward. Amanda remained quiet. Luke looked confused. Patty smiled. "Thank you all for coming." Nobody answered. She continued anyway. "I thought it would be helpful if everyone heard this together." Helpful. Another interesting word. Manipulative people love words like helpful. Transparent, fair, reasonable. The words themselves aren't the problem. The timing usually is. Patty opened the folder, explained the property transfer, explained the trust modifications, explained why signing would supposedly benefit everyone. Then she looked directly at me and made her biggest mistake. Edgar has been resisting this process for reasons that don't entirely make sense. There it was, the attack. Subtle, polite, public. The goal wasn't legal. The goal was social pressure. Make me appear difficult, make me appear stubborn, make everyone else impatient, then force compliance. It might have worked, too, if the property documents had been the real issue. Ryan sighed, exactly as Patty intended. "Dad, I don't understand why this has become such a battle." I looked at him, really looked at him, because part of me still saw the 8-year-old boy who begged me to teach him how to fish. Part of me still saw the teenager who broke his arm trying to jump a bicycle over a homemade ramp. Part of me still saw my son. And regardless of DNA, I always would. Then I looked at Luke and wondered what he was about to lose. Patty mistook my silence for weakness. Again. Second major mistake. She continued talking too much, explaining too much, pressuring too hard. Every sentence revealed the same thing. Desperation. You know that look. The look someone gets when they're trying to reach the finish line before anyone notices the race. Finally, she slid the documents toward me. "Let's finish this today." The room became quiet. Very quiet. Everybody watching. Everybody waiting. Patty smiling. Ryan frustrated. Luke confused. Amanda uncomfortable. Frank expressionless. Linda pretending not to enjoy herself. And that's when I realized something. The trap wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. She had built it herself. Piece by piece, year by year, lie by lie. All I had done was show up. I placed my hand on the folder, then gently pushed it back across the table. "No." Patty's smile vanished, completely this time. "Excuse me?" I said no. Ryan immediately sat forward. "Why?" The question hung in the room. Heavy, expectant, dangerous. I looked around the table, at every face, every relationship, every person about to discover that their understanding of the past was built on foundations they never inspected. Then I opened my briefcase, removed a second folder, much thicker than Patty's, and set it carefully on the table. Nobody spoke, not even Linda, which is impressive, because silence is not one of her natural hobbies. I opened the folder, placed the first document on top, then the second, then the third. Patty's face lost color, fast, very fast, because she recognized them, before anyone else did. And in that moment, before a single word of explanation left my mouth, I knew the afternoon was already over. The only thing left was the truth. and the truth was finally ready to introduce itself. Nobody spoke, not immediately. The room had entered that strange space that sometimes exists between a lie and the moment everyone realizes it's a lie. A space filled with silence, expectation, fear. I looked directly at Patty. She looked back at me. For 39 years I had known that face. The smile she used when she wanted something. The look she gave when she believed she was the smartest person in the room. The expression she wore when she thought she was losing control. That last one was sitting across from me now. Ryan broke the silence first. "Dad," I turned toward him. "What is all this?" His voice wasn't angry. Not yet, mostly confused, and that made what came next even harder. I took a slow breath, then opened the folder completely. "These are copies of the documents your mother asked me to sign." Ryan frowned. "We already know that." "No." I slid one page across the table. "You know what the documents say." I pointed toward the signature section. "You don't know what they are." Frank leaned forward. Right on cue. He had spent decades testifying in courtrooms. The man could explain accounting fraud with the emotional intensity of someone reading cereal ingredients. And somehow juries loved him. This signature was copied from an unrelated document. He tapped the page. Digitally inserted. Then another page. And this one. Another. And this one. Ryan stared. Amanda stared. Luke stared. Patty stared at the table. Nobody interrupted. Frank continued. "The source documents are different. The pixel density is different. The insertion artifacts are visible. The metadata timelines don't match." He pushed his glasses upward. To put it simply, these signatures were not created naturally. The room became silent again. Then Ryan looked at his mother. "What is he talking about?" Patty immediately recovered. Too quickly. Another mistake. "Your father is exaggerating." There it was. Not denial, not surprise, not confusion, minimization, the preferred defense of people caught earlier than expected. "It's a paperwork issue." "A paperwork issue?" Frank asked. His tone was polite, dangerously polite. "That's an interesting description." Patty glared at him, then at me, then back to Ryan. "Your father has always loved investigations." I almost smiled. Always. When facts become inconvenient, history suddenly becomes personality. Ryan looked uncertain. For a moment I saw exactly what Patty was trying to do. Shift the conversation. Turn evidence into opinion. Make this about me, not the documents, not the deception. Me, classic, predictable, and surprisingly effective when nobody knows the full story. Unfortunately for her, we weren't finished. Not even close. I reached into the folder again. This time I removed a stack of financial records, bank transfers, wire confirmations, payment histories, 3 decades worth. I spread them across the table. Patty visibly tensed. Good. Ryan looked confused. Luke looked completely lost. I pointed toward one highlighted section. "Do you recognize this account?" Patty said nothing. I pointed to another. "And this one?" Still nothing. Frank answered instead. "These records show recurring financial support provided to Susan Harrison over approximately 30 years. Luke blinked. "What?" Every head turned toward him. Poor Luke. He still had no idea he was standing at the center of the storm. "Wait," he said. "My mom?" I nodded. "Yes." Luke looked at Patty. Patty looked away. That tiny movement spoke louder than any confession. "Patty?" Luke asked. No answer. Again. Interesting, because people usually deny false accusations immediately. Silence is often reserved for true ones. Amanda spoke next, quietly. "You've been sending money to Luke's family." Patty finally answered. They needed help. 30 years of help, Amanda asked. No response. The room felt smaller every minute. Then Ryan stood up. Not dramatically, just enough. The way people stand when their instincts tell them something important is happening. What does any of this have to do with the property? I looked at him and realized there was no gentle way forward anymore, no gradual reveal, no softer version, only truth. So I pulled out the final document, the DNA report, the same report that had arrived at 3:07 in the morning, the same report that had destroyed my sleep, the same report that had started everything. I placed it on the table. Nobody moved. Then I slid it toward Ryan. His eyes moved across the page, slowly, then faster, then back again. His face changed, first confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper, something painful. What is this? His voice barely worked. I answered softly. A DNA match. Luke leaned closer. Ryan continued reading. Then he froze. Because he reached the name. Luke Harrison. The room stopped breathing. Honestly, that's the only way I can describe it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the sounds from outside seemed distant. Luke finally reached for the report. Read it himself, then looked at me, then at Ryan, then at Patty, then back at the report. Again and again. No. One word. That's all. No. Patty closed her eyes. Ryan stared at his mother. What is this? No answer. His voice rose. What is this? Still no answer. Then Luke spoke. The quietest voice in the room. Patty. Nothing. I need you to understand something. The most painful part wasn't the shouting. There wasn't much shouting. The most painful part was watching people realize their memories could no longer be trusted. That's a different kind of loss, a deeper one, because memories help us understand who we are. And suddenly everyone's memories were under attack. Finally, Ryan looked at me. You knew? Not everything. How long? Since the DNA notification. His eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, not movie tears, real ones, the kind grown men hate, the kind nobody can stop. Then he looked at Patty and asked the question I had been expecting for weeks. Is he my father? Patty broke. Completely. The control disappeared, the confidence disappeared, the performance disappeared. For the first time all afternoon, I wasn't looking at the woman who manipulated situations. I was looking at a frightened 63-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades running from a question, and finally ran out of road. She began crying, hard, not strategically, not theatrically, honestly. I didn't know. Ryan stared. What? I didn't know. The words came between sobs. I never knew. Nobody spoke. Patty continued. There were 2 possibilities. Luke lowered his head. Ryan looked physically ill. Amanda reached for his hand. He didn't notice. I thought it was Edgar. Patty's voice trembled. I wanted it to be Edgar. Then she looked toward Luke, and everything fell apart. I was terrified it wasn't. Luke looked like someone had removed gravity from the room. His face had gone completely pale. The DNA report sat on the table between us. Silent, merciless, undeniable. Ryan suddenly laughed, a terrible laugh, the kind people make when pain arrives faster than logic. So all these years, nobody answered, because there wasn't a good answer. There wasn't even a decent one, just damage, years and years of damage. Then Ryan asked the final question, the one everyone had been avoiding, the one that truly mattered. Who am I supposed to be now? Nobody had an answer, not Patty, not Luke, not me, because the truth had finally arrived. And the truth, despite what people say, doesn't always fix anything. Sometimes it simply destroys the lies and leaves everyone standing in the rubble. Nobody left the room for nearly 20 minutes. That surprised me. If you'd asked me beforehand how that meeting would end, I would have predicted shouting, doors slamming, people storming out, maybe somebody throwing a coffee mug. Instead, everyone stayed exactly where they were, because sometimes pain arrives so suddenly that movement becomes impossible. Ryan remained standing beside the table. Luke sat motionless. Amanda quietly cried. Patty stared at the floor, and I found myself studying my hands. Those old hands, wrinkled, scarred, a little stiff from age, the same hands that taught Ryan how to cast a fishing line, the same hands that held him when he was 6 years old and broke his wrist falling from a tree, the same hands that signed every school permission slip, every report card, every birthday card, every Christmas gift tag. For 37 years I had never questioned who my son was. Now everyone else was questioning it, and strangely enough, I wasn't. Not anymore. Eventually Ryan spoke. Not to Patty, not to Luke, to me. What happens now? I looked up, and realized he genuinely didn't know. Neither did I. That was the problem. People imagine truth as the finish line. It isn't. Truth is usually the starting line, the moment you finally discover what race you're actually running. I don't know, I answered honestly. Ryan nodded, a small nod, almost grateful, because fake certainty would have felt insulting. A few minutes later, Luke stood. I need air. Nobody stopped him. Nobody could have. He walked outside. Amanda followed shortly afterward. Then Ryan, leaving only Patty, Frank, Linda, and me. The silence felt ancient. Finally, Patty spoke. I never meant for this. Frank almost laughed. I could see it. Barely. The effort required to prevent a sarcastic response was impressive. Patty continued. I never wanted any of this. I believed her. That's the strange part. I truly did, because intentions and consequences are often strangers. You can genuinely want to avoid hurting people, and still spend decades doing exactly that. Patty looked older than she had a few hours earlier. Much older. The confidence was gone. The control was gone. The carefully managed image was gone. All that remained was a woman staring at the wreckage of decisions made 36 years earlier. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Deeply tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles somewhere behind your ribs. You should have told the truth. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Patty laughed bitterly. What truth? That question hit harder than she intended. Because technically she was right. There had never been certainty. Only fear. Fear disguised as confidence. Fear disguised as control. Fear disguised as protection. And now that fear had finally failed. By evening, everyone had gone home, except me. I drove to Sparks Lake, alone. The family cabin sat quiet beneath gray clouds, the same cabin Patty had tried so hard to secure through those forged documents. The same cabin my father built decades earlier. The same cabin where Ryan caught his first trout. The same cabin where Luke spent half his summers. Funny, isn't it? The place at the center of the property dispute suddenly felt completely irrelevant. I sat on the dock for almost an hour, watching the water, thinking, trying to understand how a DNA report had somehow become a mirror. Because that's what this story really was. A mirror, showing everyone who they had become. Patty became a woman controlled by fear. Ryan became a man forced to question his identity. Luke became collateral damage in a secret he never created. And me, I became something unexpected. A father trying to separate biology from love. Not as easy as it sounds. Not as hard as people think. The legal consequences arrived quickly, much faster than the emotional ones. Frank formally challenged the property documents. The forged signatures were impossible to defend. Within weeks, every questionable transfer attempt was effectively dead. Patty's leverage disappeared overnight. That part felt satisfying. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You spend 35 years exposing fraud, and watching fraud fail still feels good. But the satisfaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, because after that came reality, and reality was messy. Ryan stopped answering my calls. Not permanently, just temporarily. He wasn't angry at me exactly. He wasn't angry at Luke. He wasn't even angry only at Patty. He was angry at existence, which frankly was understandable. Luke handled things differently. He became quieter, more cautious, more thoughtful. A man trying to reconstruct his own history one memory at a time. Several weeks later, he called me. The conversation lasted only 11 minutes. I remember because I checked afterward. Neither of us discussed fatherhood. Neither of us discussed DNA. Neither of us discussed Patty. Instead, we talked about fishing. A ridiculous conversation, completely ordinary, entirely unnecessary, and somehow exactly what both of us needed. People underestimate ordinary conversations, especially after trauma. Sometimes discussing fishing is easier than discussing identity. A month later, Linda forced me out of the house, literally. She showed up unannounced, again. Apparently respecting personal schedules is not one of her hobbies. We're going to lunch. I have things to do. No, you don't. I absolutely do. She looked around my empty living room. No. Unfortunately, she was correct. An hour later, we were eating burgers near Drake Park. Halfway through lunch, she pointed a French fry at me. A dangerous gesture. French fries should never be weaponized. You know what's bothering you, I sighed. This should be good. You think you're supposed to feel victorious. I stopped chewing. Because she was right, completely right. The property fraud had failed. The lies had been exposed. The evidence had won. By every practical definition, I had prevailed. So why did it feel terrible? Linda answered before I could. Because this wasn't a competition? Exactly. That was the problem. Nobody really won. The lies lost. That's different. The lies lost. But people still got hurt. A lot of people. As summer approached, one final step remained. The DNA confirmation test. A laboratory-grade test. Not a consumer ancestry service. Not estimates. Not probabilities. Scientific certainty. The appointment was scheduled. The samples collected. The waiting began. And life continued in that strange space between suspicion and confirmation. Then, on a Tuesday morning in June, the results arrived. The email notification appeared at 9:14 a.m. I stared at the screen for nearly 30 seconds before opening it. Because part of me already knew. Part of me had known for weeks, maybe months, maybe years without realizing it. Still, certainty carries weight, real weight. I clicked the file, read the first page, then the second, then the conclusion. And suddenly, 36 years of uncertainty collapsed into a single answer. An answer that would change everything. Again. The laboratory report was 23 pages long. I read exactly one sentence. Then I stopped. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did, completely. The conclusion sat there in black letters against a white background. Cold, precise, final, probability of paternity 99.9998%. Luke Harrison was my biological son. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. No dramatic reaction, no shouting, no tears, just silence. After everything that had happened, certainty felt strangely quiet. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window. The maple tree in my front yard moved gently in the morning wind. A squirrel ran across the fence. A neighbor walked his dog. Normal life continued. That's one thing nobody tells you about life-changing moments. The world doesn't pause. The birds keep flying. The traffic keeps moving. The coffee still gets cold. And somehow you're expected to continue existing inside a completely different reality. I printed the report, placed it inside a folder, then sat there for almost an hour, thinking about Luke, thinking about Ryan, thinking about the fact that one answer had somehow created 100 new questions. Around noon, my phone rang. Luke. I stared at the screen, then answered. Hey. Silence. A long silence. Then, you got the results? Yeah. Another silence. Neither of us wanted to say the words. Eventually, Luke did. So it's true. I closed my eyes. Yeah. More silence. Then something happened that I'll never forget. Luke laughed. Not because he was happy. Not because anything was funny. It was the laugh of a man whose entire identity had just shifted 6 inches to the left. You know what's strange? What? I spent 36 years wondering why I never felt connected to my father. I didn't answer. He continued. And now I feel guilty for thinking that. The sentence broke my heart, because it contained exactly the kind of confusion I had expected. Not anger, not resentment, confusion, real confusion, human confusion, the kind that comes when two truths collide. The man who raised him mattered, and so did the truth. Both things could exist at the same time. We talked for nearly an hour, mostly about practical things, meeting, talking, taking things slowly. Neither of us wanted to force a relationship into existence. Relationships don't work that way, especially at our ages. You don't suddenly become father and son because a laboratory says so. You become father and son one conversation at a time, one fishing trip at a time, one shared memory at a time. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you become something else entirely. The point is that DNA starts conversations. It doesn't finish them. 3 days later, Luke came to my house. I made burgers. He brought pie. Honestly, neither of us knew what else to do. So we ate, talked, walked around the backyard. At one point, we stood in the garage looking through old fishing equipment. The same garage where this entire journey had really begun. The same garage where I found the Christmas card. The same garage where suspicion first turned into investigation. Luke picked up an old tackle box. Ryan and I used this one. I know. He smiled. You still have it? Of course. His smile faded slightly. Then he asked the question I had secretly been waiting for. Do you regret knowing? I thought about that. Really thought about it. Then answered honestly. No. Even after all this, especially after all this. He nodded slowly, and I think he understood. The truth had hurt. But the lies had already been hurting people for decades. The difference was that nobody could see the damage before. A week later, I received a text message from Ryan, the first direct message since the family meeting. My hands actually shook opening it, which is embarrassing, but true. The message was short, very short, only one sentence. I don't know what to call you right now, but I'm listening. I read it 6 times, maybe 7. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did, perfectly. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't certainty. It was a door, a small door, barely open, but open, and after everything that had happened, that was enough. I replied, you can call me whenever you're ready. Nothing more, no pressure, no speeches, no emotional ambushes, just truth. Ryan didn't answer immediately. In fact, he didn't answer for another 11 days. But eventually he did. Then again, slowly, painfully, awkwardly. We started rebuilding, not repairing. Rebuilding, different process, different expectations. Patty moved into a smaller house outside Bend later that year. The legal issues ended quietly. The property remained protected. The forged documents became worthless. The financial manipulation stopped. She called me once, about 6 months after everything. We talked for 14 minutes, mostly about practical matters. Then, just before hanging up, she said something I'll always remember. I spent 36 years trying to avoid one answer. I waited, and that answer destroyed everything anyway. I looked out the window, thought about Ryan, thought about Luke, thought about all the years that couldn't be recovered. Then I answered, "No." She was silent. I continued, "The lie did that." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then the call ended. And strangely enough, that was the last real conversation we ever had. Today, things remain imperfect. That's important. I don't want to pretend otherwise. Luke and I have built something meaningful. But we're not making up for 36 years overnight. Ryan and I talk regularly, but there are still scars, still questions, still difficult days. Some wounds heal, others become part of who you are. And maybe that's okay. Maybe healing isn't about returning to who you were before. Maybe it's about learning how to carry the truth without letting it crush you. These days, I spend more time fishing, more time with family, more time appreciating ordinary moments. Because ordinary moments are what secrets steal first, and they're what truth eventually returns. Looking back, that notification arrived at exactly 3:07 in the morning. One small alert on a phone screen, one name, one moment, and yet it changed every chapter that followed. Not because DNA defined our family, but because the truth finally had a chance to. Life lesson. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's this: the truth is not always kind. Sometimes it arrives late. Sometimes it arrives after years of damage have already been done. Sometimes it costs relationships, comfort, certainty, and the version of life you thought you understood. But even then, truth is still better than a lie that grows roots. Because lies don't freeze time. They keep causing damage in the dark. A lot of us have experienced something similar in our own lives. Maybe not a DNA test. Maybe not family secrets. But many of us have discovered that the story we were told wasn't the whole story. And when that happens, remember this: your identity is bigger than a secret. Your worth is bigger than a mistake someone else made. And the people who truly love you are not defined only by blood paperwork or biology. They're defined by the choices they make when life becomes difficult. Sometimes family is given to us, sometimes family is built, and sometimes it's both. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.